When I collapsed at work, my family vanished. Days later, they tried to steal my life through the courts. But what I did next ended everything. I always thought collapse was something that happened to other people. The kind of thing you read about in news articles or overhear in break room gossip. Not me. I was the reliable one, the dependable one, the one who carried everything without complaint. But the truth is, my body had been whispering for months, and I kept shoving those whispers into silence. Headaches that lingered, dizzy spells I brushed off, a sharp pressure in my chest I told myself was just stress. I thought I could outrun it with enough caffeine and over time. That Monday afternoon, I was halfway through preparing a client presentation. The boardroom was full of chatter. The hum of printers in the background, my laptop open, pages of notes stacked in neat piles. I stood to grab a folder from the printer, and in the space of a single heartbeat, everything went black. No warning, no slow fade. Just nothing. When I opened my eyes again, the ceiling was fluorescent white. A beeping monitor echoed somewhere above my shoulder, and tubes ran into my arm. My chest felt heavy, wrapped in wires. A nurse leaned over me, adjusting a drip, her face calm but serious. "You had a cardiac event," she said. The words barely made sense. I was 32 years old, too young to be lying in a hospital bed with doctors throwing around phrases like cardiac event. The strangest part wasn't the fear. It wasn't even the shock. It was the absence. Because after the doctors stabilized me, after they checked my ID and called the number listed under emergency contact, no one came. Not my mother, not my father, not even one of my sisters. The staff was kind. They reassured me someone would show up soon. But hours turned into a day, then two, and still no familiar faces appeared at the door. The only sounds were the shuffle of nurses' shoes and the mechanical sigh of machines, keeping time with my heart. I told myself they were busy, that maybe they hadn't gotten the message that any moment the door would open and I'd see them rushing in. But the door stayed closed, and that silence was louder than any siren I'd ever heard. I had always known my place in the family. I had felt it in the sideways glances, the forgotten birthdays. The way every sacrifice I made was treated as an obligation instead of a choice. Still, part of me believed that if I were ever truly in danger, if something happened that stripped away the daily noise, they would be there. Lying in that bed, staring at the ceiling, I realized how wrong I was. And just when I thought their absence couldn't cut any deeper, I picked up my phone on the third day, desperate to see some message, some sign that they cared. There was only one notification waiting for me, a photo dot. It was my family, smiling around a picnic table by the lake. My mother's deviled eggs right in the center. The caption read, "Family Day without the drama," and they tagged me. That was the moment everything I thought I understood about my family shattered. And to make sense of it, to understand why being erased could hurt worse than the collapse itself, you have to know what came before. You have to know the illusion of perfection. They built-in the role I was forced to play in it. On the outside, my family looked flawless, the kind of family that neighbors envied and relatives praised at reunions. We had the smiling holiday cards, the backyard barbecues, the posed photos where everyone wore color-coordinated outfits. Online, my sisters made sure of it. Julia posted sun-soaked pictures of us at the lake. Claire uploaded videos of us decorating the Christmas tree, and my mother's Facebook was a shrine to family togetherness. To anyone scrolling past, we were a portrait of unity. But I knew better. I had always known better, because behind the smiles was a hierarchy. At the top were Julia and Claire, the golden daughters. Beneath them, my parents, who treated their flaws like charming quirks. And somewhere at the bottom, almost invisible, was me. Julia had a way of making failure look glamorous. She could wreck her car at 19 after a night out and still walk. A way to applause about how lucky she was to learn the lesson, young Claire once flunked an entire semester in college, and my parents turned it into a story about self-discovery. When I achieved something, it became background noise. The year I won a statewide robotics competition, my mother's first words weren't congratulations. She looked at the trophy, nodded once, and said, "Did you thank your coach?" That was the rhythm of my childhood. My victories were footnotes. Their mistakes were milestones. And no matter how much I gave, it was never seen as generosity. It was duty. As I got older, I told myself it would change, that once we were adults, once I proved myself, they would finally look at me differently. But adulthood only made the roles sharper. Julia became a social media influencer with sponsorships and staged photo shoots. Claire dabbled in one failed business venture after another, each collapse softened by help that somehow meant me. And my parents, they never asked how I was doing. They asked how I was helping. Bills, loans, deposits. I paid them without hesitation, because deep down, I believed it was buying my way into the family picture. If I filled the gaps, maybe one day they'd see me not as the background character, but as part of the story. But the truth was harder. I wasn't a son or a brother in their eyes. I was an accessory to the illusion, the reliable shadow that made their spotlight look brighter. And the longer I stayed in that role, the more invisible I became. So when I collapsed, I wasn't surprised they didn't rush to the hospital, not really. What stunned me was what they did instead. Because while I was lying under harsh fluorescent lights, still hooked to machines, they were somewhere else, building their picture-perfect world without me. And the first proof of that betrayal came with one single photo. The first 2 days in the hospital felt like an eternity. Every time footsteps echoed down the hall, I thought it might be them. Every time a nurse pushed open the door, my heart jumped, hoping she was about to say, "Your family is here," but no one came. Not a text, not a call, not even a missed notification. Just silence. By the third day, I convinced myself maybe there had been a mistake, that somehow the hospital had called the wrong number or my parents hadn't checked their phones. I reached for mine, fingers trembling against the IV line, desperate. For proof that I was wrong, there it was. One notification. It wasn't a voicemail. It wasn't a text asking if I was alive. It was a photo Julia had tagged me on Instagram. A picnic table by the lake, sunlight spilling across the water. My parents smiling in their lawn chairs, Claire raising a glass. Right in the middle of the table sat my mother's deviled eggs, the ones she always made for special occasions. The caption read, "Family Day without the drama." And there, in bright blue, was my name tagged beneath it. I stared at the screen so long the display dimmed. It wasn't just the cruelty of the words, it was the audacity. They hadn't forgotten me, they hadn't lost my number. They knew exactly where I was, and instead of coming, they made me into the punchline of a family joke. I tried to imagine what that day was like for them. Did my father tell a story about how hardworking Julia was while I lay in a hospital bed? Hooked to machines, did Claire laugh and toss her hair, pretending nothing was wrong while I counted the hours alone? Did my mother pass around a plate of deviled eggs as if her son hadn't collapsed at his desk? The photo told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't absent because they didn't realize what happened. I was absent because they wanted it that way. Something inside me snapped, but not in the way most people imagine. It wasn't rage. It wasn't a scream or a breakdown. It was quieter than that, sharper, like a door closing for the last time. I stopped waiting for the door to open. I stopped hoping they'd show up. The nurses kept checking on me, their voices soft, their hands steady. My coworkers sent flowers with handwritten notes. Strangers showed me more kindness in 3 days than my own blood had in 30 years. That realization was heavier than any diagnosis, and yet, just when I thought I had seen the worst of their indifference, something else happened. For days after my collapse, my phone lit up, 74 missed calls, a single text from my father. "We need you, answer immediately." "No, how are you?" "No, are you okay?" Just a demand. As if my value to them had nothing to do with whether I was alive or breathing, I felt the calmest I had in years. Not relief, not fear, just a hollow steadiness. Because if they weren't going to see me as their son, then I had to stop seeing myself as their safety net. And that's when I remembered someone I hadn't called in a very long time. Someone the rest of my family had written off, but who had always been there in the shadows, waiting. My grandfather, Walter. When my father's text came through, something in me hardened. 74 missed calls, a demand to answer immediately, and still not a single word about the hospital. Not a single word about me. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty ignoring them. I felt nothing. Instead, I scrolled through my contacts until I found a number I hadn't dialed in years, saved under a name I never deleted. Walter, my grandfather. He picked up on the second ring. No pleasantries, no small talk, just a steady voice asking, "Which hospital?" That was it. He didn't ask why I hadn't called sooner, didn't lecture me for the silence between us. He simply asked where I was. 40 minutes later, he walked through the door like a man who'd already been expecting this day. Same windbreaker he'd worn for as long as I could remember, the same scratched wristwatch that had ticked through decades. His face was calm, almost a calm, like he wasn't surprised at all to find me hooked to machines. He pulled up a chair, leaned back, and said, "So they finally broke you too, huh?" I didn't even ask how he knew. I just nodded. Walter stayed with me the entire day. He spoke to my nurses, asked real questions about my recovery, quietly. Slipped his card to the billing desk when one of my tests wasn't covered by insurance. He never made a show of it, he just did it. The kind of presence I didn't realize I'd been craving my whole life. Then, after hours of silence broken only by the hum of hospital machines, he pulled out a worn leather notebook and a tablet. "Let's get to work," he said. We went. Line by line through my finances, what I thought were small favors to my family had multiplied into a web of debts I hadn't even noticed anymore. My name sat on 5 different loan agreements, 3 credit cards I never used but still paid off, a car insurance policy for a vehicle I didn't even drive, auto transfers to Julia's account every 2 weeks, deposits into Claire's rent, fund payments on my mother's car. I had been so busy surviving, so consumed with helping, that I hadn't realized how deeply they'd embedded me into their lives. I wasn't just supporting them. I was the foundation holding their world together. And the cruelest part was, they treated it as expected, as though I owed it to them. Walter didn't interrupt often, but every so often he let out a quiet sigh, the kind that sounded equal parts disappointed and unsurprised. Finally, he closed the notebook and looked at me. "You've been their safety net for years, not a son, not a brother, just the scaffolding propping up their mess. It's time to take it down," so we did. One by one, we cut the cords. The auto transfer to Julia's account, gone. Claire's rent deposit, canceled. My mother's car insurance, removed my card, changed the password. And that loan Julia had conveniently stopped mentioning, flagged with a fraud report filed. Every click felt like peeling away a layer of weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. For the first time, I wasn't patching their holes. I was letting them sink in the mess they had created. By the time Walter left that evening, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Secure. Not because I was free of debt, not yet, but because I finally had someone standing beside me. Someone who wasn't afraid to tell the truth. And as if on cue, just as the last account was closed and the last cord cut, my phone lit up again. Calls, texts, voicemails, piling one after another. Mom, Dad, Julia, Claire, demanding answers. All panicking now that the machine had stopped feeding them, their world was starting to crack. And I was about to watch what happened when the scaffolding they had built their lives on finally came crashing down. It didn't take long for the silence to end. The moment the money stopped moving, my phone turned into a siren. Missed calls stacked by the dozen. Notifications buzzing so fast, I had to silence the device. What struck me most wasn't their concern, it was the tone. Not one of them asked how I was recovering. Not one of them mentioned the hospital. Every single message was about themselves. The first voicemail was from my mother. Her voice, tight and impatient, said, "I don't know what you're trying to prove, but this isn't the way to do it. No fear, no compassion, just irritation like I'd broken an appliance she needed fixed." Then Julia texted, no words at first, just a screenshot of her checking account, $29 a minute later. "What the hell is going on? Fix this." As if I had accidentally forgotten to refill her allowance, Claire tried a softer approach. Her message stretched into paragraphs heavy with guilt-tripping. "I don't know what drama you're caught up in, but I've always loved you. Please don't punish me for things I didn't do." I almost laughed. The last time we'd spoken, she had rolled her eyes when I said I couldn't co-sign another lease, then ghosted me for months. But now, suddenly, she was the innocent one, begging for peace. And my father, he was the loudest of them all. He parked outside my apartment one evening, headlights flooding through the blinds, sitting there like a sentinel waiting for a hostage release. I didn't move. Hours later, he sent a text. You're about to destroy everything we've built. I hope you understand the damage you're causing. Everything we've built." The words made me laugh out loud in that dim hospital room because nothing they had was built. It was borrowed, taken, patched together with my paychecks and my silence. And now the structure was collapsing. But panic does strange things to selfish people. They don't retreat when the scaffolding falls, they claw harder. The calls doubled, then tripled. My voicemail filled with accusations, half-threats, and desperate pleas. Julia accused me of ruining her career. Claire begged me to be reasonable. My mother insisted that family sticks together, as though family hadn't abandoned me in the ICU. And my father, his voice grew harsher each time, demanding I step up like a man and fix the mess. I realized then that I was no longer the son they ignored or the brother they sidelined. I was the villain in their story now, the scapegoat for every late payment, every lost opportunity, every debt they had piled onto my shoulders. For the first time, I didn't feel fear at their anger. I felt clarity. Their panic wasn't about me. It was about losing Mithaleva, the safety net, the ATM they'd mistaken for blood and bone. And just when I thought their desperation had reached its limit, it escalated into something darker, something calculated. Because the calls weren't just noise anymore. They were the prelude to a plan to take everything back, not through guilt or begging, but through the law. The messages were bad enough, but what came next nearly knocked the air out of me. One morning, a nurse stepped into my room, looking uneasy. She said there was a woman downstairs, insisting she was my medical proxy, demanding access to my doctors. My stomach tightened when the nurse read the name Claire. I hadn't listed her. I hadn't listed any of them. The only name on my emergency contact forms was my grandfather, Walter. Yet here she was, trying to take my place in my own care. I told the nurse no one was authorized but him. Security escorted her out before she got anywhere near my room. I thought it was just another one of Claire's melodramatic performances, a stunt to get attention, but I was wrong. Hours later, Walter walked in carrying a manila envelope. He didn't say anything at first, just dropped it onto the bed with that same calm expression he always wore when the truth was uglier than I wanted to admit. Inside were printed emails. My parents and sisters had been corresponding with a small law firm I'd never heard of. The subject line chilled me: guardianship, petition. I read each line slowly, making sure I wasn't imagining it. They weren't just smearing me behind my back. They were actively trying to take control of my life. The emails described me as unstable, erratic, incapable of managing finances after a traumatic medical event. They even used my decision to cut off payments as evidence of emotional volatility. Their goal was clear: file for emergency conservatorship. If a judge believed their story, they could freeze my accounts, reopen credit lines, undo every step Walter and I had taken. In the eyes of the court, I wouldn't be Daniel anymore. I'd be property managed, controlled, silenced. It was the same tactic I'd seen in headlines about celebrities trapped in legal cages. Britney Spears flashed across my mind. But this wasn't Hollywood. This was my own family, ready to sign. Papers declaring I was incompetent just because I stopped paying their bills. Walter stayed steady, even as my hands shook. He told me this wasn't the first time. Years ago, my parents had floated the same idea about his brother, my uncle, when he tried to cut ties with them. Back then, it fizzled out. This time, with real money at stake, they were serious. I sat there, heart monitor clicking beside me, and realized the weight of it. They would rather label me insane than accept a life where I wasn't their crutch. Moved fast. Walter's lawyer drafted a preemptive response. My doctors signed notarized statements confirming I was lucid, mentally sound, and fully capable of managing my affairs. My employer provided a letter explaining I was on voluntary leave, still in good standing. We even submitted phone records and copies of their own messages, the 74 missed calls, the demand texts with no mention of my health. By the time their lawyer tried to file, the petition was dead on arrival. A judge never even set a date. Their attempt collapsed before it could reach the courtroom, but the damage wasn't undone. Because once a family is willing to declare you unstable, once they're willing to rewrite your story as madness, you can never go back. Something fundamental had broken. They had failed to trap me in court, but they weren't finished. People like them never stop when they lose control. They just changed tactics, and their next move wasn't legal. It was public. When the legal route failed, they pivoted to something sharper: public opinion. It began with Julia. One night, while I scrolled idly through my phone, her face appeared on my feed. The video was shaky, the lighting low, her makeup smudged just enough to look accidental. She sniffled, stared into the camera, and said, "Mental illness doesn't always look the way you expect. My brother is going through something dark, and we're trying to help him, but he keeps lashing out and hurting the people who love him most." She never said my name. She didn't have to. Every follower knew exactly who she meant. Within minutes, the comments rolled in. "You're such a strong sister. Stay patient. Praying for your family. He's lucky to have you," strangers offered. Her sympathy like it was currency, pouring love into the same hands that had erased me from family photos while I lay in a hospital bed. Claire reposted it, adding a single heart emoji and the words, "We just want peace." My mother shared it on Facebook with a line about how families must stick together through hardship. And my father, who had never cared about social media before, suddenly appeared in the comments thanking people for their prayers. It was a performance, and I was the villain in their script. At first it worked. Old friends texted me cautiously, asking if I was okay. A former coworker emailed to say they'd heard I was struggling. Even an old girlfriend messaged, her words dripping. With pity, the narrative was taking root. I wasn't independent. I was unstable. And then someone pushed back. A stranger in the comments, someone I didn't even know, posted a screenshot of Julia's old caption, "Family day without the drama." Right next to it, they placed a frame from her crying video. Side by side, the hypocrisy was impossible to miss. The internet devoured it. In hours, the comments turned. Sympathy curdled into suspicion. People started asking where that concern had been when I was in the ICU. Screenshots spread like wildfire. Old posts resurfaced, my mother smiling at a dinner party one day after my collapse, Claire tweeting about moochers faking trauma, Julia bragging about trips to Miami, funded by money she'd begged from me. The tide shifted fast. Julia's sponsors dropped her within days. Claire's boutique was review-bombed into oblivion. My father was called out in threads that reached his workplace. By the end of the week, he was placed on leave. 2 weeks later, he was let go. Their perfect family façade, polished for years, cracked wide open under the weight of their own lies. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to explain myself. The truth was speaking for me. But victory didn't feel like triumph. I didn't feel joy watching them scramble. I felt distance, like I was staring at people I once knew from the other side of a glass wall. They had turned my life into a storyline, and when it backfired, they played victims again, and they weren't finished. Losing sympathy online only made them more dangerous. When manipulation fails in public, selfish people retreat to the one weapon they believe still matters: blood. That weapon came in the form of a letter that would drag me into the oldest battlefield family's no inheritance. Just when I thought the storm had passed, another blow arrived, sealed in a crisp, white envelope. It came from the county clerk's office, hand-delivered to my hospital room. For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, it was something human. A card, an apology, some acknowledgement that they had gone too far. But inside wasn't comfort. It was a will. Not my grandfather's, not some distant relative's. My father's drafted. Only a week after their failed conservatorship attempt, it spelled out what little remained of his assets. The house, already half-emptied by debt, a few investments, cracked and bleeding value, and then at the bottom, written in his own shaky handwriting, the words that made my chest go cold: "All assets shall pass to the family members who maintain unity." Daniel is disinherited until he returns to this family and reconciles. I read it 3 times, my hands trembling against the paper. Not because I wanted any of it. I had never asked for their money, never cared about inheritance. I had spent my life giving, not taking. What shook me was the message hidden beneath the words. One final trap. It wasn't about property. It was about control. A last attempt to tether me with guilt, to pull me back into the orbit I had broken free from. They weren't leaving me behind. They were daring me to come crawling back. For the first time since this entire nightmare began, I laughed. Not a bitter laugh, not hollow, a real one. because they still didn't understand. I didn't want their legacy. I didn't want the scraps they'd been pretending were riches. All I had ever wanted was peace. Walter helped me draft a response. That very night, it was short, simple, final. A legal waiver renouncing any claim to their estate. A permanent no-contact order. Documents removing them, as next of kin, for every medical and legal matter in my life. I wasn't being erased. I was erasing them. And yet, the ink was barely dry before I sensed what would come next. Families like mine don't surrender with paperwork. They don't vanish when the legal games end. They always try one last card, one last confrontation, to claw back control. Didn't have to wait long, because my father wasn't finished. He was coming to see me face to face. I thought the letter was their last move. I thought silence would follow. But silence, in my family, never lasts. It was a week after I signed the waiver when Walter spotted a familiar car idling at the end of his driveway. My father's sedan, the same one he used to drive us to Little League, the same one that smelled of old leather and stubborn cologne. Now it sat there like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to stay inside, let him stew in the cold. But I knew better. This wasn't going to end with him driving away. So when the knock finally came, sharp and deliberate against Walter's front door, I answered. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not in size, but in stature. His shoulders hunched, his eyes rimmed red, his suit wrinkled like he'd slept in it. Still, his voice carried the same command he'd always used to bend me back into place. "Son," he said, "this has gone too far. You need to stop this nonsense and come home." I didn't move. I didn't invite him in. I just stood there, the threshold between us, and asked, "Home? Where was home when I was in the hospital?" He blinked, caught off guard, then pushed. "Forward. You don't understand the damage you're causing. You've ruined your sister's futures, embarrassed your mother, destroyed my career. Is that what you wanted? To tear us down?" His words spilled out like accusations in a courtroom. Every sentence began with blame, none with accountability. He wasn't there to apologize. He was there to rewrite the story one last time with me as the villain. I let him finish. I let him rant until his face flushed and his voice cracked. Then I said the one thing that had been sitting heavy in my chest for months. "You didn't lose a son, you lost your ATM." The silence that followed was heavier than his shouting. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Walter, standing just inside, crossed his arms, his presence like a wall behind me. For once, I wasn't alone in facing him. Father's eyes flicked between us, searching for leverage, but finding none. Finally, he straightened, his pride piecing itself back together like a cracked mask. "You'll regret this," he muttered, stepping back toward the car. "Family is forever, Daniel. You can't erase blood." I watched him walk away, watched the car disappear down the road. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel dread when the door closed behind him. I felt release, because he was right about one thing. Blood is forever, but peace is a choice. And peace was the only inheritance I wanted. The day my father drove away from Walter's house was the day something inside me shifted for good. The fear, the guilt, the endless sense of obligation, they didn't vanish overnight, but they loosened, like a chain I'd been carrying finally slipping from my shoulders. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for the next demand, the next crisis, the next phone call that would pull me back into their orbit. I was free. Walter and I packed up within the month. He'd always said he wanted to see the mountains again, before his time was up, and now I understood why. Sometimes distance isn't just a choice, it's survival. We found a small cabin on the edge of a quiet town, tucked between pines and open sky. No marble countertops, no polished family portraits, no curated perfection for the world to see. Just wood, silence, and the sound of our own breathing. I took a remote job, cut my hours, relearned how to live at a pace that didn't grind me down. Some mornings I'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the fog roll through the trees, and wonder how I had ever survived so long in that old life. Other days, Walter and I would drive into town for groceries, and I'd catch him smiling to himself as if he knew this was where I was supposed to be all along. The past didn't vanish. Every so often, someone from that old world tried to reach me, a cousin sending a vague message. a neighbor forwarding one of Julia's half-hearted apology posts, even old acquaintances who'd seen the drama online asking for the real story. But I never explained, because explaining would mean reliving it, and I'd already given them enough of my life. Let them tell their version. Let them keep spinning their tale where they're the victims, where I'm the cruel brother who abandoned them. People like them are good at writing stories that make themselves the heroes. They need that. I don't. I have the truth. And the truth is quieter, less flashy, harder to put into a hashtag, but it's stronger. The truth is that peace is better than being loved by people who only love you when you're useful. And in the stillness of those mountain mornings, with Walter humming softly beside me and the world finally at arm's length, I realized something simple. I hadn't lost a family. I'd found one. In the end, my story isn't about losing a family. It's about finally finding peace. And sometimes, peace means walking away from the people who are supposed to love you the most. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Your support means everything and keeps us bringing you the truth behind family drama stories.